All right, great. Thank you for joining us. We're very pleased to have with us the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Pierre Krähenbühl, who is here to talk to you about the fundraising campaign. And Pierre, I believe you're speaking to us from Amman. Is that correct?
That's correct, Stefan.
Great.
Yes.
All right. Well, Pierre, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and thanks for the opportunity in particular to address you this afternoon. I was today in Gaza to launch the campaign entitled Dignity is Priceless, which we launched following the announcement by the United States of its reduced contribution to UNRWA, which faces and confronts us with an unprecedented financial crisis. You are aware that UNRWA has always faced challenging financial circumstances, but there is no doubt that this one is unprecedented in scope and in nature. And obviously what is at stake today is, first and foremost, not UNRWA as an institution, but the access for 525,000 students to our education work. It is the question of access to... maybe we just leave it.
Okay.
Sorry. No.
All right, Pierre, why don't you go ahead? The video will adjust. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, just to say, so the issue that is at stake is that the access for 525,000 students to our 700 schools in the Middle East. And this is a fundamental right, obviously. It's an issue that is of great importance to the entire community. They are engaged and passionate about education. And so in order to be able to sustain these activities, which are central to the capacity also of Palestinians to preserve opportunities, but also vital to the stability of the Middle East, it is absolutely essential that these activities be preserved and protected. It's similar for our healthcare activities, for which the agency is well known, well respected. It is 3 million patient visits a year to our 140 clinics. And remember that I'm speaking here of clinics that are not only here in Amman, in Beirut, and in other of the regional capitals. I'm speaking here of clinics that are maintained in areas and environments like Aleppo, like in the outskirts of Damascus, in obviously very difficult camps in Lebanon, in the West Bank, but also, of course, the Gaza Strip. It is absolutely clear that these activities need to be sustained. And the same goes for the emergency assistance that we provide for 1.5 million Palestine refugees, in particular in critically affected regions. Obviously Syria, Gaza and the West Bank come foremost to mind. So it is clear that any change to the income that we require is of great concern to the agency. And you know that the announcement by the United States was of $60 million for 2018. Last year we received in total $350 million, so this is obviously a very significant change in our situation. That is why the campaign that we launched today, Dignity is Priceless, is a campaign that aims to mobilize $500 million, because we will really need a major shift in order to cover the grounds that need to be covered this year. And in doing so today, it was also an appeal to individuals of goodwill, to institutions, to the Palestinian diaspora, to foundations and private companies, to mobilize in ways that are very different from the past and to date. This is very important, that there is a great deal of sympathy and solidarity for Palestine refugees and for UNRWA's work around the world, and we wanted to connect and capture that particular form of mobilization. Now, it is clear that in parallel to this specific aspect of today's campaign, there is also, of course, an outreach to member states of the United Nations. As you know very well, we were not a self-declared agency. We are specifically tasked and mandated by the General Assembly to carry out this role in favor of Palestinian refugees until a time when a just and lasting solution has been found to their plight. And therefore, again, a very important effort on multiple fronts to overcome this particular crisis moment. Now, I was joined today at the launch by two of our students. Karim is the president of UNRWA's Central Student Parliament. He was recently elected to that role at the impressive age of 13 and represents, therefore, as part of a newly created body, the Central Student Parliament of all of UNRWA's 700 schools. He represents 525,000 students, and his message was very clear today. He said he sees his education and the education of other students at risk, and he wishes to tell the world that they are proud and determined students who want the world to support them in becoming global citizens and pursue their dreams and aspirations. He also emphasized that this campaign is not the campaign of UNRWA, it is the campaign of these students, it's the campaign of all Palestine refugees, whether they be in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, or the Gaza Strip. And he called on all of his fellow students across all of these areas to take initiatives to join this campaign, to prepare kites, balloons, songs and poems to highlight why the education is a right and why it is the constituent element of their future. We also had Young Islam, who is again a member of the student parliament at the Gaza level, the Central Gaza Student Parliament, and she emphasized also that this campaign is their campaign and they are determined students, and she was calling strongly on students worldwide to join them in their appeals for support. Her message was it is important to help us keep UNRWA schools open, and so funding UNRWA is a very key element at this stage. And again, I emphasize it from the perspective of the dignity of refugees, the preservation of their opportunities, and clearly also a measure of regional stability. So with that, Stefan, I hand back to you, and I'm very happy to take any questions. It was certainly a very important moment today for UNRWA, and I thank you for the opportunity to join you.
Pierre, thank you very much. Maggie?
Hello, Mr. Krähenbühl. It's Margaret Bashir with Voice of America. Thank you for the briefing. A few questions. First of all, did the U.S. make clear to you what reforms they're looking for from UNRWA? Because both the State Department spokeswoman and Nikki Haley said last week that they want some sort of reforms from your organization before they give you any further funding. And also, what's on the chopping block program-wise if you don't meet your funding goals, and when would that start to happen? I mean, how soon would you have to cut, for instance, food rations or close clinics? That's sort of an outcome. And just if you'll indulge me, one final question. You said this morning that you wanted to confirm to all Palestinian refugees that UNRWA's mandate is firmly protected in the General Assembly, and you said it is not for sale, and it was extended by 167 countries. Just what do you mean by it's not for sale, if you could clarify that? Thank you. Sorry for so many questions.
Thank you very much. So the first point, let me begin with what's at stake. Again, as I said earlier, the crucial element is the education for 525,000 students. We run 700 schools, have 22,000 employees. These are school principals, teachers, education specialists, and others. They are, for the vast majority of them, Palestinian refugees themselves who provide this education. And again, in areas of great polarization, great tension, and great difficulty. So that is the first thing that is at stake and that we need to preserve, and we want to absolutely take every measure possible to prevent any disruption of this education services, because in 2015 we came very close to a moment, because of a previous financial crisis, where it almost reached the point where we had to postpone the beginning of a school year in September. That was 2015. And it created shockwaves in the community, and in particular it also created strong reactions in the host countries and countries of the region. I think here in particular of reactions in Lebanon and Jordan, but also in Israel. I was regularly contacted and asked by Israeli officials what was happening to UNRWA funding, why was there a risk to the education, a concern obviously by all stakeholders in the region about the disruptions and instability that this could create. Of course, as I said earlier, it's also the access to clinics that need to be preserved and that are at risk if the funding pattern that we've seen now is continued and we don't find solutions to this. I am absolutely determined to find solutions, and this is exactly why we're not taking an attitude of wait and see. Why immediately and at a very short period of time we launched this ambitious campaign today, and that we will be seeking, and together and working with the Secretary General under his guidance, to seek the support to creating also outreach and new funding alliances with member states and other institutions. Gordon Brown has many times been quoted and was on panels with me where he says that he wishes to remind the world that UNRWA is the single largest provider of actual education services across the UN system. And this is not to belittle the efforts of others, this is just to emphasize that we actually do direct service delivery. So all of this is at risk if we do not find solutions to the current funding situation. So the first step that we took was to contact other partners and donors to see whether they would be in agreement to advance their contributions of 2018. And a number of countries have done so. I think here of Belgium, of Sweden, of Switzerland, I think of Norway, Finland, and others are currently considering, the Netherlands and other countries. The EU is also looking into this. Now, obviously, when I say advance, this means these are the foreseen amounts for 2018, but just being paid earlier to allow us, as it were, to keep the schools open, to keep the clinics open while we develop these new strategies and approaches. Then you asked about the questions and the conditions or the reforms that have been requested. I will say very clearly to you, we were notified of a $60 million contribution. We have not yet, and we maintain obviously very open and very engaged dialogue with US representatives. This has been a tradition. The United States has been for decades our single largest donor, a generous and consistent contributor for which we are immensely grateful, and we have excellent relationships across the US government. And I must emphasize that when I went to Washington in November last year for very senior level discussions, these were part of conversations that we normally have with each donor during the year. The support and the recognition for UNRWA's role in those meetings was very firmly expressed to me. As you can imagine, in every relationship with a donor, there are critical questions that come up, there are debates that one has about reforms, and UNRWA is a very reform-minded agency. But I have not been communicated and I have not received any specific indication at this point from the US administration about specific reform-related questions. And I must tell you that I am absolutely clear in my mind that the decision that was taken in funding terms was not related to our performance. But obviously, we maintain all the channels open with the US government and look forward to ongoing engagement. On the mandate, the point is simply to say that there is always a concern in the Palestine refugee community about the mandate of UNRWA and how the international community sees Palestine refugees. As you can imagine, at different moments in their history, they have felt more or less considered or more or less forgotten. And with all the multiplicity of crises currently in the Middle East, with situations in Syria and Yemen and Iraq and in Libya, not to mention, of course, further far with situations like in Bangladesh or Myanmar or other crisis points, the concern among the community is what is happening, how does the world see us? And so my message to them was to say, be reassured. The international state community remains very concerned about your situation. The issue is not about the mandate, it is about a funding situation, and the two things have to be considered separately. That was my message.
Great, thank you. Luke?
Thank you. Luke Vargas with Talk Media News. I understand this budget shortfall is quite serious for UNRWA, but it is just $65 million. And as you look across the OCHA funding system, there are shortfalls that dwarf this. If it's in Syria or Yemen or South Sudan, What do you say to the charge that too much attention is being made to this relatively small budget shortfall in the grand scheme of the UN's operations?
Well, I have two things that come to mind. One is just factual, and then maybe one is more general as a personal observation. Let me start with the factual. What has been communicated to us to date by the US government is a contribution for 2018 of 60 million. Last year, we received from the United States 363 million. So that's obviously a bigger gap than the one that you're referring to. And so that's a very significant change. Now, with this, of course, I am not in a position to say whether the United States intends or not at another point in the year to provide additional contributions. This, of course, is not for me to comment on because I do not have that part of the information. But I was just looking in purely factual terms, 60 million announced for this year against 363 million last year. And again, this touches different parts of our funding streams, the core program budget, which is for education, healthcare, and obviously the emergency appeals, for which the Americans have been consistently a formidably generous donor. And of course, if indeed there is no money coming to our emergency appeals, then that would indeed be a serious concern for us in the course of the year. Now, to your point about whether or not, in comparison to other crises, there are, bigger ones or others. I mean, I have now worked for 25 years in conflict zones and in the humanitarian environments. I've always refused to create ranking of suffering between different crises because, of course, if we were sitting today in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the eastern part of that country, no doubt we would feel extremely, concerned and torn and probably confronted with suffering on a scale that would feel incomparable to many other things. If we were today, of course, in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, we would wonder what is happening and what's the future of the Rohingyas. But the thing is, it is not by saying to Palestine refugees that there's greater suffering somewhere else in the world that their situation improves. And I have to tell you that the one thing that everybody should remember, let me just give you the indication about the young generation of Palestine refugees. So take all of the young Palestinians and Palestine refugees that are below the age of 24. They were all born after the Oslo Peace Agreement. And what they were told by their leadership, but also by the world, is that if they believed in negotiated processes, if they believed in moderation and in a political path, a solution would be found. The problem is that this has not happened. And so there is definitely today a very closed political horizon. And I don't need to comment on it in political terms because that is not UNRWA's role, but we are confronted on a daily basis with the human consequences, and many of them very extreme, of the unresolved political situation in the Middle East. And we take our mandate very seriously, and I respect fully that, of course, there are many other crises in the world. This is one of the reasons why, when I approach donors, I always do so with a full understanding of the complexity and multiplicity of crises that they have to face. But again, as we said today, Palestine refugees' dignity is priceless, and this is something we consider as very important, and it is our specific task.
I'll just hear.
Hi, thanks so much. James Reinl, Arab News. I've got two questions for you. First question, you went through a list of donors that you've been approaching: Belgium, Sweden, EU, usual suspects. I'm wondering if you've looked towards the Gulf. UNRWA has long spoken about them as a potential donor. Have you had any specific conversations with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, someone like that? Can you give us an update there? Second question, the Trump administration has ultimately cut the funding for UNRWA because it wants to put pressure on the Palestinians towards some kind of peace deal with the Israelis. Given that being the basis for the Trump administration's decision, is that making it difficult or awkward for some of these European donors that you're approaching? I mean, if they were to stump up $65 million, then they would be basically negating any leverage that the Trump administration might be able to get against the Palestinians. And in doing so, might frustrate the White House, the administration, and that might be something that a small country like Belgium or Sweden might not want to do.
Thank you. So on the Gulf funding, it is very clear that in comparison to many other UN and humanitarian agencies, I think UNRWA has generally been quite successful in mobilizing Gulf contributions. When you think of it in these terms, the United States has been the single largest donor in recent years, the European Union, the second largest, and Saudi Arabia, the third. Now, that is not insignificant in any sense, and Saudi Arabia, for example, and the UAE have invested significantly in our, for example, reconstruction projects in Gaza, in the aftermath of conflict, but also in building or rebuilding schools and clinics, all very important for the sort of institutional backbone that we are in the Middle East. It is true that comparatively they have invested less in the core funding to our core activities, education, healthcare, and others, although this has evolved in recent years with two very good years in 2015 and 2016, where both Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait were critical in helping us to close the shortfall. I will be very honest, last year was more disappointing. We were at lower levels than expected from the Gulf countries in general. We were at a 3.5%, or let me put this in context. The League of Arab States members committed in the 1980s to contribute to 7.8% of UNRWA's core funding. This was achieved in 2015 and 2016, but then last year we dropped to 3.5%. So clearly, there is a renewed effort and mobilization that is required there for our funding to become sustainable. And then you asked about the pressures or the way in which the funding may have been used in terms of achieving political objectives. This is a very important point. Of course, I cannot confirm or comment on the nature of the deliberations that led inside the US government to the decision. This is not something that I'm privy to. But I will say this. There has always been a consensus, and this is a consensus derived from good humanitarian donorship, from conferences such as the World Humanitarian Summit, but it has also been a consensus that has guided US support to UNRWA for decades, which is that there may very well be differences of opinion in political terms with actors in the field that we are operating in, but there was always a consensus to preserve the humanitarian budgets that funded UNRWA. And I think, as a general comment, it is very important, and I've always advocated for that, as have all other heads of humanitarian organizations, that it is very important to preserve humanitarian funding from political considerations. We fully accept that it is a sovereign decision of any country, including the United States, to decide how much money will be contributed to a given humanitarian organization, including UNRWA, but the principle of preserving it from political considerations should be established, and we certainly will continue to follow that very closely.
Thank you. Fethi and Matthew.
Thank you very much. This is Ahmed Fadi from American Television News. Are you concerned at any point of the donors' fatigue? There is, as you listed, there are crisis zones all over the globe now, and with the shortfall in the contribution to UNRWA from the US government, or a threat, as we have seen a couple of years ago, to sway UN decision in other areas or to suppress reports. Are you concerned at this point that there is a donor fatigue for the other humanitarian crises? And there is a call, at least from Washington, that the Arab states would put more heavier weight into filling the gap of UNRWA funding? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, if you look at it purely numerically, let me start with that. I can't say that we have seen, if I set aside for 1 second the just recently announced US decision, I cannot say that we have seen over the last 5 and probably even 10 years any significant drop in funding to UNRWA. Rather, in numerical terms, the trend has been of a gradual increase of contributions. Modest, but an increase. The problem and the challenge that UNRWA faces is twofold. On the one hand, we of course operate in incredibly conflict-affected regions. I mean, it's clear that with the Gaza conflict in 2014, with the ongoing dramatic conflict in Syria, which affects hundreds of thousands of Palestine refugees as well, in addition to ongoing difficult circumstances in Lebanon and certainly very tense circumstances in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, you have a situation where you have a growing community, growing needs, and certainly very acute needs at certain times of acute conflict. That has put a lot of pressure on our budgets and has required an increased capacity by UNRWA to mobilize financial resources. This is where the gap has started to grow between a modest growth of contributions and a more faster growth of needs to be covered. Now, of course, like every organization, UNRWA understands that the humanitarian sector is one that is very rarely fully covered. Obviously, most appeals globally, struggle to get covered, certainly in the UN system, but even in the NGO family. So it is, of course, a challenge. You have to remember that where UNRWA's particular challenge lies in terms of its activities is that we are a quasi-state-like service provider. And of course, if you have to plan education services for 525,000 students, if the income falls short, and you suddenly would be in a position to only provide, just for the hypothesis of it, education for 400,000 students the following year, you will have protest demonstrations, and you will have, very, very serious anger in the community. And that would happen probably in every country, but certainly is even more acute with Palestine refugees. So I think the call is on every single member state of the General Assembly to mobilize in support. And of course, you're right, the United States is certainly saying that it feels it has been carrying a very large burden in terms of its financial contribution, which once again, I say, has been historically incredibly generous, very consistent, formidable trust in the agency, and that we think should also be the basis for the future. Now, we are certainly prepared to work with the US, with Canada, with the European Union, and many others to broaden the basis of our donors. By the way, we are actively engaged in this, and I would like to just note here that we are the first agency, as far as I'm aware, that has achieved a multi-year funding agreement with the Russian Federation, for example, a clear example of our efforts to diversify the donor base.
Thank you, Pierre. Matthew?
Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, and thanks for all these previous answers. I wanted to, I guess, go at it a different way. You'd mentioned the Myanmar and the Rohingya and Cox's Bazar, and so I just wanted to ask you, it seems like one of the issues is sort of the overall sort of purpose of UNRWA, or sort of having a separate agency for this one ongoing refugee crisis. Could you, if you were today to look at the plight of the Rohingya that have fled Myanmar, that seem to be there's some intractable issues, what would be the benefit of setting up a separate UN agency for the Rohingya, as opposed to dealing with the issue through UNHCR or other agencies? Do you see a benefit to that? Not that you can undo what the current situation is, but can you sort of contrast the benefits of a crisis-specific agency as opposed to using the UN's usual panoply of agencies? Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I think the first thing that would come to my mind would be that I would hope that, and I think this is very much a message that comes from the Secretary General as well, that among the, what you call the panoply of options open to the United Nations and to member states and to the state community, there would be a much greater belief, and here I really have to underline belief and commitment to political conflict resolution. One of the reasons why we're in the situation that we're in the Middle East is we have seen a almost an irresistible temptation by the international community to engage in conflict management. And I can assure you, we are a very clear example of what happens when you do conflict management. You can do conflict management forever and you get 70 years of UNRWA, but you'll get 70 years of everybody else as well. And I can assure you also that nobody in UNRWA, starting with me, has any intention of seeing UNRWA be here for another 70 years. But because our mandate is so intimately connected and tied to the achievement of a just and lasting solution and a conflict resolution in the Middle East, we have to accept that that hasn't been particularly successful, and therefore our ongoing existence is there. Now, the rest of your question is, of course, largely, in a sense, covered by the fact that in historical terms, we were created before UNHCR was created. Nobody can say today what would have happened had UNHCR been created first. And I think today it is clear that for refugee situations around the world, UNHCR is the primary actor with a mandated responsibility to cover those situations in partnership with many NGOs and others. And UNRWA remains with its historic mandate, and that we are very determined to implement. I think the one thing I can say that is unique and uniquely successful, I mean, there were many things I would love to tell you about because I feel very passionate about it, but let me focus on education. I think there is just no other example, not even in current, very advanced refugee responses. And with this, I really, again, do not wish to comment on anybody else's work, but just to highlight the extraordinary vision that led from the very start UNRWA to engage in education. Because when you deal with refugees, or for that matter, victims of armed conflict around the world, and you distribute food or provide emergency medical activities and other things that come to mind, what you're doing is you're looking at people as victims. When you invest in education, you're also looking at them as actors of their own destiny, potentially, preserving their opportunities, their skills and capacities. Over 2 million Palestinians have graduated from UNRWA schools since the 1950s. Imagine what an investment that is. Probably one of the most advanced human development projects in the Middle East in any sense, and something that the World Bank, referring to our education system, calls a global public good. So that is something that is definitely there, and I'm sure, if we had the means, which we don't have now, that would actually be of great value for the international community to mobilize some of our teachers for responses to education situations in other refugee contexts. I have no doubt that many of UNRWA staff would be extremely proud to contribute to responses elsewhere in the world. We're not there yet, and we're currently in the battle to keep our own schools open, but certainly that is one of the great lessons learned of this organization.
Thank you. Masood?
Thank you very much. My name is Masood Haider. I represent Daily Dawn newspaper of Pakistan. Beside the funds that you need for the Palestinians, one of the things that the agency needs is the employees that it has. It has multiple employees, it has all over the Middle East and so forth. How many employees does it have, and how many Americans are employed by this agency to what you call dispense this aid to the Palestinians? Do you have that figure?
So if I understood you correctly, it's both how many we have globally, how many staff we have globally, and what was the second part of the question?
How many Americans work for
How many Americans?
Oh, how many Americans? Yeah, thank you. So we have 30,000 full-time employees, which makes it undoubtedly the single largest UN civilian agency in that sense. And the main reason for this is that we employ, because we run the schools and we run the clinics and other installations ourselves. In other words, in the same way as a state would have its teachers and education specialists, its doctors and nurses, we have that public civil service system. And so we have those 30,000 employees. Of those 30,000, more than 98% are Palestinian. So we have a very small number, roughly around 200 plus staff who are international. And I would be happy to check the exact number of American citizens around that, but I presume that we would find we probably have around 25 of them, but I'm happy to check the exact figure just to make sure I don't give you false information. But it cannot be much more than that in any case.
Thank you. Oleg, then Nizar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Zelenin with TASS News Agency. Just a follow-up. Do you understand that there will be a pull-out by the American employees, and do you plan layoffs from the civilian employees you have because of the lack of funding? And also you mentioned an agreement with Russia. Was there any promise of contributions? And could you also name any other countries you are trying to work out any financing agreements with after the pullout of the funds by the US? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, there's no intention to withdraw any staff for any nationality, and not American staff. I think we are UN staff, and in that sense we represent, regardless of our nationalities, both the integrity and the vision of the United Nations, but also we, of course, reflect the neutrality and partiality that comes with it. And so, as UN staff, we should reflect that first and foremost before the nationalities that we represent individually. So unless there would be a specific threat or specific pressure addressed to one or the other staff, which can always happen, but for the moment we are absolutely determined to preserve all of our staff. The layoffs and the impact on our staff is of course a key issue. Needless to say that UNRWA's Palestinian staff are very worried about their situation. And remember, in particular, there are different reasons why they're worried. They're, first of all, worried because anybody would be worried about losing employment or not obtaining the full payment of his or her salary, which is always a possibility at this stage, depending on how much income we actually receive. But in addition, of course, Palestinian colleagues, I have to remind you, are not paid against international comparators, as is the case for all other UN national staff. Our staff are paid against local comparators. So an UNRWA teacher is paid against the comparator of a Jordanian teacher, a Palestinian teacher, and others, which may seem very reasonable in the context, but is, of course, in terms of how the staff are actually paid in comparison to other UN staff, an issue of fairness that needs to be understood. We're not going to change that paradigm. It's a paradigm that has been in existence, and for some good reasons, for a long time. But of course, that means that the pressure on our staff is even greater. So we have told, and I've told the staff, that we will do everything in our power to protect them. But it is clear that if we fail to mobilize the sufficient means to make up for the reduction in US funding or for our general financial pressure that we are exposed to year after year, we, of course, then would run into a difficult situation at a later point in the year. For the moment, we are trying to protect that to the best extent possible. The Russian contribution agreed and signed in a decree by Prime Minister Medvedev is now of a $2 million per year over a 5-year period, so it's a total of 10 million. And this is, again, significant because it stabilizes the Russian contribution, makes it predictable, and certainly we hope in the future that we can continue to build and maybe expand, certainly increase the amount as well. But it was a very important step when it happened. And I think we have also seen this, of course, as an example and an illustration of what could be done in the context of BRICS countries, because you asked what other countries we're approaching. Brazil is already a member of UNRWA's Advisory Commission, which means it is a regular donor to UNRWA. We are seeking increases and have obtained, actually, increases from India. We have had China increase. The levels are still comparatively lower than some of our long-standing donors, but my experience with funding and funding relations is it always depends on the relationship that you build, so it will always take years to increase and develop. We will look for other opportunities elsewhere in Asia, certainly are also keen to expand it in other parts of Europe. I think there's still strong potential with certain European countries. So we're clearly not at the end of our efforts in that regard.
Thank you, Nizar, and then I'll let you go, Pierre. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Nizar Aboud of Al Mayadeen Television in Lebanon. You alluded in many of your earlier statements that stability is at stake if the UNRWA is deprived of contributions. Of course, in your mind probably was the issue of the diaspora Palestinians and the right of many people in the Middle East view UNRWA as a scheme to do away with the right of return. Do you think by depriving UNRWA of any contributions will bring the issue of the right of return to the fore, to the front?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for that comment. You know, I think, let us just imagine for 1 second if UNRWA no longer existed. I really don't think that any Palestinian or any Palestine refugee would give up his or her quest for justice, for a solution, And I certainly don't think that I've met any single Palestine refugee who per se has given up the thought about the fact that the right of return is enshrined in UN General Assembly resolutions. So I don't think that UNRWA distracts from any of those issues. I mean, one of the things that one could say is that, you know, UNRWA may have, through the consistency of its services and what we have provided, relieved a little bit the pressure on those states, both in the region but also beyond the international state community, to actually have to deal with the political resolution of the conflict. But I also want to say we need to remain very humble in UNRWA. There are far larger issues at stake in political and other terms than UNRWA. And when I speak about regional stability, I think mainly of the fact that it was very visible in 2015 when we faced our earlier large funding crisis and financial pressure, to see how the reactions unfolded in front of us and around us in terms of suddenly the education system of UNRWA and the provision of education by UNRWA being at risk. I think Palestine refugees thought that everything could be challenged except education. And to suddenly see this at risk was probably one of the biggest shocks that they felt. And I remember very well discussing with senior Jordanian officials, for example, the fact that the access to UNRWA education for 120,000 Palestinian boys and girls in Jordan, if that was not provided and assured, and this is a quote from one senior official who told me, this is a matter of national security in our country. So I do see it in those terms. And, you know, I say it humbly, I don't want to overstate it, but I do think that people and countries around the world that are worried about risks of radicalization, of increased polarization, should take a close look at this extraordinary community of 525,000 students that we have in our schools, and who are determined and show incredible courage in the education and in their investment. And I think it is in nobody's interest in the region, not for Jordan, not for Palestine, not for Lebanon, not for Egypt, certainly also not for Israel, to see those services being destabilized. There are too many other issues that are uncertain in the Middle East. That one really doesn't need to be added to the list, and that's why we allow ourselves to highlight that strongly.
Great. Pierre, on those words, thank you very much. We wish you best of luck with the campaign, and thank you again for joining us from Amman.
Stefan, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the opportunity. We really appreciate it, and have a very good afternoon in New York.
Thank you.